Ճամբաշտոնյաները հենց այդ ժամանակ եկան Հայաստան, առաջին այցելությունները Միացյալ Նահանգներ մեր պաշտոնյաների կողմից հենց այդ ժամանակ եղան դեպի Միացյալ Նահանգներ եւ ըստ էության հայ-ամերիկյան հարաբերությունների հիմքը ընդունված է կարծել, որ դրվել են հենց այդ ժամանակահատվածում Հայաստանի անկախությունը ճանաչելուց հետո, որը տեղի ունեցավ
independence which happened
դեկտեմբերի 25-ին
on December 25, 19.
ավարտի հայտնի ելույթից հետո հաստատեցին է ճանաչեց Հայաստանի անկախությունը
Bush senior de facto recognized Armenia's independence and stated that the U.S. intends to establish diplomatic relations with the newly independent former Soviet states, including the Republic of Armenia. By the way, interestingly, before that, when Armenia was still not officially recognized, the Armenian leader, the first president, had already a visit to Washington and met with, in the White House, met with President Bush. If not officially, then U.S.'s latent foreign policy in Armenia began right after the 1988 earthquake, because on December 7, 1988, Soviet leader Gorbachev was in New York meeting with President Reagan and President-elect Bush. And that, as soon as that news came, after hours, he cut short his visit and returned to Moscow to then travel to Soviet Armenia to understand on the ground what happened, because the news was very ambivalent, reaching even Moscow. It was difficult for news to even reach Moscow as to what happened in Armenia. At the time, Bush became very actively engaged in the founding of bilateral relations. The U.S. were the first to send aid to Armenia. Hours after the earthquake, the first American armed forces planes delivered aid to the town of Spitak. These were the first steps by the Bush administration. Although he hadn't entered into office, he was supposed to enter office on January 20. But Reagan was the outgoing president, and he would transfer these powers to the president-elect George Bush Sr. In the U.S., right around that time when the Soviet Union began to crumble, to collapse, hadn't even completely collapsed, there were discussions of what Washington's foreign policy to the newly independent states should be, what priorities it should have, what principles should they work on. From that time on, the U.S.'s political, scholarly and academic circles developed this approach that everything must be done to stop Russian influence from rebounding in former Soviet states, including naturally the South Caucasus, including naturally the Central Asian countries, and not only academic circles, not only research centers, but also the whole state apparatus of the U.S. became actively engaged in that field with the aim to minimize Russia's influence over this region, to bring it as close to zero as possible, which was accurate because Washington now had a chance of working directly with all the region's states, including the resource-rich Azerbaijan, the resource-rich Central Asian states. So you did not any longer need to strike a deal with Moscow. You could talk straight to Baku, talk straight to Almaty, and lead the process without Moscow's agreement. This unleashed new horizons for the U.S. and the region for economic activity as well. And right around that time in the U.S., that was the opinion that they needed to utmost reduce Russia's influence over the region. How was that to be done? In the U.S., the calculation was that if in the region, the South Caucasus, speaking of the South Caucasus, there are no conflicts, then Russia's engagement, Russia's influence over our region will be significantly lost. Now, of course, at the time, there were conflicts. The Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh First War was in its active hostilities phase. There was also a conflict, the Armenian-Turkish. It was not a hot conflict, but a cold one. Borders were closed. No bilateral relations whatsoever. Turkey did not want to open the border to establish diplomatic relations. Armenia, even though Armenia as an independent state, Turkey was one of the first to recognize independent Armenia. But to date, we have no diplomatic relations. And to date, our common border has not once been opened, well, actually, with the exception of a couple of cases, which were really more of a humanitarian nature. through the solution of the regional conflicts to reduce Russia's influence in this region was something that gained flesh and blood, especially when the hostilities in Nagorno-Karabakh stopped and Turks in Washington started to more actively look into this region. Our region, the South Caucasus, was never of strategic importance to the U.S. However, the individual countries here have not had strategic importance for the U.S., and there's a reason why in the U.S. national security strategies under different presidents, once under Clinton, that the region was mentioned in the U.S. national security strategy, once under the Biden administration, the South Caucasus was mentioned with the view that the U.S. under the Biden administration will use all its diplomatic leverage to resolve their conflict in the South Caucasus. The South Caucasus conflict, obviously, was the Artsakh conflict and the Armenian-Azerbaijan relations. So the foundation that was laid in the early 90s evolved under all presidents, and up until the Biden administration, really pretty much the same principle, resolving the conflict as a way to reduce Russian influence. That was always the line that was maintained. When the U.S. historically, in the last 30-35 years, saw that it was possible for Armenian, Turkish, Yerevan and Azerbaijan relations to achieve progress, they very promptly got engaged. Not by coincidence that all the Armenian Turkish normalization initiatives came from Washington. They were under the administration of Bush Sr., Clinton, then Bush W., then Obama. In 94, Armenia's president, the Pakistan first president, was invited to the White House for a first ever official visit because for the Clinton administration, his views on the resolution of the NK conflict and the Armenian-Turkish relations were acceptable. Everyone understood that these two processes were interconnected, but they were trying to disentangle them, detach them, which never actually worked. The second time the U.S. saw the window for resolving at least one of these two problems, in this particular case, the NK problem, the Armenian-Azerbaijani relationship context, that was when President Kocharyan, that was Armenia's second president, was invited to First Key West with his counterpart, Aliyev, Haydar Aliyev, at the time, the then Secretary of State Colin Powell had talks with them. The understanding with the White House was that if there were a possibility to make progress, if there were any possibility to make progress, both leaders would be invited to the White House, and the president would have separate, and he did have separate meetings with the two leaders. That was exactly when the offer on the table in Key West was the so-called corridor. Azerbaijan wanted to be connected with Nakhichevan via the territory of Armenia. Technically, of course, it was a different type of connection than the one that is presented or portrayed or conceived today. Of course, it was a different situation back then. But the Armenian side would agree and would say, yes, we can agree in that way. If MK gets de facto recognition, we can also allow Azerbaijan to have that linkage. Azerbaijan did not agree to that because any weakening of its position on the MK would undermine Aliyev's stay in power and his conveyance of power to his son. So he chose the option of keeping the power and passing it on to his son. As to the third attempt to normalize Armenian-Turkish relations, it was the so-called football diplomacy when Armenia's third president, Suren Sargsyan, was in office at the time. The football diplomacy quite actively was circulated. Of course, it was mostly dealt with by the so-called three co-chairs. It wasn't about the Armenian-Azerbaijani relations, but the three Minsk group co-chairs, US, France, and Russia, mediated this process. But the most active was the U.S. Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, who aimed to become president, was the most active, and obviously she needed some foreign policy achievements to showcase in her election campaign so that in 2016 she would get elected president of the U.S. Now these were the three main stages. Three presidents of the U.S. working together, discussing, using different opportunities to discuss those processes. Came a fourth stage after the change of power in Armenia. And then again, there was historic chance seen in the U.S. to regulate the problem, but an exceptional option, because now we're dealing with a situation where Armenia was willing to give up on all types of hardline positions, actually did give up, was ready to meet all of Turkey's preconditions, all of Azerbaijan's preconditions, and this naturally created fertile ground for one-sided unilateral concessions as a way to resolve regional conflicts. Essentially, in those last 35 years, this was the picture in our region, and this is the U.S.'s engagement and the activity by stages. For the U.S., as I noted, our region has no strategic importance. But given the geography, the region is per se important to the U.S. because, after all, the neighbors of the South Caucasus are U.S.'s number one opponent, Russia, important strategic partner, later number Turkey, and obviously the number one rival, the U.S., Iran. This, of course, makes the region very interesting for the U.S. and its active engagement is very important here for Washington. In the context of bilateral relations, the U.S. does not have deep strategic bilateral relationships, and it cannot, because there really are no preconditions for having very deep strategic relationships with the three states, which we cannot say for the region. So the U.S. would have liked this to be a region where it would have, similar to the Baltics, three countries, similar foreign policy aspirations, to integrate with NATO, to integrate with the EU, and so on. But as in our region, there are three different countries with three different foreign policy perceptions. The latest election in Georgia is now broadly changing the big picture in our region. And obviously, the U.S. The U.S.'s regional approach cannot be secured. And it will continue, in my opinion, to work with the individual states with a lesser agenda as for Armenian-American bilateral relations. In different months, Armenia is the U.S.'s 165th to 170th trade partner, so no deep trade partnership. Like, I have a hard time imagining how Armenia could be of interest to the U.S. I mean, geography-wise or resource-wise, because we don't have gas or oil or sea access or trade turnover or a big market. Hence, what would be of interest to the U.S., or what investments would the U.S. want to make in a small economy, small population Armenia? So, the Armenian-American relations agenda predominantly circled around U.S. aid by the United States. In recent years, the U.S., in the last 30 years, the U.S. put in $2.5 to $3 billion of aid in Armenia, which is per capita the highest, or one of the highest aid figures ever given by the U.S. to any country. And of course, the top of the line is Israel, it's now going to be Ukraine and other countries, but Armenia certainly is one of the per capita aid recipient leaders. It's not by coincidence that in recent years, under the Trump administration, by the way, Trump had no sort of meeting with his Armenian counterpart. Never, ever, any meetings. He became the first and only president to not only have not met, not even have a phone call with his Armenian counterpart. Same is true for Biden. Biden, 4 years of presidency, such active engagement in the Armenian-Azerbaijani relationship normalization and the Armenian-Turkish normalization process. Not a single phone call. Not a single meeting with his Armenian counterpart. This, again, is a rather exceptional thing because all former presidents already had meetings with their Armenian counterparts. The Americans with their Armenian counterparts, but this truly is very exceptional. The first high-level contact that happened just a few days ago, Armenia's prime minister had made a congratulatory phone call to Trump, congratulated him on getting elected. Usually these protocol conversations or dialogue or phone conversations last 2 to 3 minutes. And I think it's just a protocol nature because Trump, I believe, according to our latest calculations, received 87 such phone calls from all over the world. Different leaders. Now, if healthy states don't talk to each other, they don't have discussions, that means that in the bilateral relations there are no problems that only they could solve, and there are no critical issues that would be worthy of the attention of the United States. So very briefly, I think that's all I wanted to share with you about the history of Armenian-American relations and their current state as to Trump. I think, unlike his first presidency, the second term will be a bit more active in terms of his foreign policy engagement because he was leaving in 2020. The world was very different from the world to which he's returning in 2024. And he cannot just set aside certain things or forget or completely overlook certain things, such as the Armenian-Azerbaijani relations in the talks. It's come to a point where Biden is sending a letter to the heads of Armenia and Azerbaijan, telling them to sign the letter before he leaves, before the end of the year. Sign the letter, he says. Sign the bilateral agreement. So some things are happening, which there's agreement, the text could be signed or pre-signed at least, initially. What's that deal? What's going to happen to that deal under Trump is hard to tell, but I don't think that he would come and quickly say, hey, rush to sign and thank you to the Democrats and Mr. Biden for this wonderful achievement. I think that ain't going to happen. He may drag on some time to continue the talks and then reach a point where he would be able to claim the credits, get the Nobel Prize for Peace, which he's long spoken about. It's really his dream, pretty much. And I think that in the coming months, we'll see some specific steps or statements in this direction by Trump's team before it comes into office. And after January 20, I think the situation will crystallize further. Thank you very much.